She did not leave in the middle of the night. She did not pack her things or slam a door or deliver the kind of speech that echoes through a house for years. Dorothea simply stopped answering. And it was only then, in the unbearable quiet of a woman who had gone still, that Alistair understood what he had been doing for 4 years. Not loving her poorly. Worse than that. Not noticing her at all. This is not a story about a dramatic betrayal. It is not about a rival who stole something, or a secret that destroyed everything in a single night. This is the story of something far more common and far more cruel. A love that existed in full, on both sides, inside a marriage that never once created space for either person to say so. She loved him quietly, persistently, and alone. He was too armored to see it. And by the time he finally looked, truly looked, the woman he found was one who had already learned to live without him. What happens next will stay with you long after this story ends. If this kind of story reaches something in you, the slow ache of being present but unseen, the quiet courage of a woman who keeps going anyway, then you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to Dukedom Stories and make sure you never miss a tale like this one. Hit that bell so the next story finds you the moment it arrives. Now, let's begin. The candles burned tall and still that evening, casting a golden glow across the marble floors of Ashworth Cathedral. Every seat was filled. Every face wore an expression of admiration for the flowers, for the music, for the impeccable cut of the Duke's coat. No one thought to look at the bride's hands. They were trembling, ever so slightly, beneath the weight of white gloves she had never chosen for herself. Dorothea stood at the altar with perfect posture, and a smile so carefully constructed that even her own mother believed it. She had rehearsed that smile in the mirror for 3 days, not out of joy, but out of necessity, because she had learned, long before that morning, that the world rewards a woman who performs happiness far more generously than one who dares to feel something else. Alistair, Duke of Carwick, did not look at her when she reached his side. He looked ahead, composed, unreadable, as if the ceremony were simply another obligation penciled into a very full calendar. And perhaps, for him, it was. But for Dorothea, it was the first day of a life she had not quite agreed to. The organ swelled, the vows were spoken, and somewhere deep inside her chest, something very quiet said, "This is not how love is supposed to begin." There was a particular kind of power that Alistair carried with him, not the loud, demanding sort, but the kind that rearranged a room simply by entering it. Conversations shifted, postures straightened, women laughed a little louder, and men chose their words with considerably more care. He was not cruel. He was not unkind. He was simply absent, present in body, unreachable in every other way that mattered. Dorothea watched this from a careful distance in the early months of their marriage. She observed how he could spend 3 hours at a dinner table surrounded by some of London's most brilliant minds and return home saying nothing of substance. Not because he had nothing to say, but because saying things required a kind of openness he had long since closed off. She began to understand that Alistair did not avoid conversation out of arrogance. He avoided it out of habit. And habits built over a lifetime are not easily dismantled by a wife who has not yet been granted permission to try. What no one outside those walls understood was the precise weight of living beside a man who made you feel, without ever intending to, that you were slightly less than visible. Alistair never raised his voice. He never dismissed her in public. He simply did not ask. Not how her day had been. Not whether she was sleeping well. not whether the house felt too large for one person to inhabit alone. The questions never came, and Dorothea, being the woman she was, eventually stopped waiting for them. By the time their first winter together had passed, Dorothea had become remarkably efficient at a skill most women of her station were never required to name: the art of presence without vulnerability. She attended every dinner, every drawing-room gathering, every afternoon call with the grace expected of a duchess. She wore the right colors. She said the right things. She laughed when laughter was appropriate and fell silent when silence was safer. What she did not do, what she had quietly resolved never to do, was allow anyone to see the place inside her where something tender was slowly going dark. It had not been extinguished. Not yet, but it had learned to keep itself very small, very still, like a candle cupped in both hands against the wind. She was protecting it. She simply was not entirely sure anymore what she was protecting it for. The irony that pierced her on certain long evenings was this: she had married a man admired by hundreds, and she lived more alone than she ever had in her father's modest country house, where at least the loneliness had been honest. Here, it wore silk and attended the opera. Here, it sat across from her at a mahogany table set for two and said, without words, "I am here and I am nowhere near you." And she smiled, because she had learned, above all else, to smile. There was a book she kept on the window seat of the east drawing room, a small, unremarkable volume of poetry that she would set aside the moment she heard his footsteps in the corridor. Not because he had ever criticized her reading, but because the book was the one place where she allowed herself to feel, and she had decided, without quite realizing when, that feeling was something she could no longer afford to do in his presence. It was in the small gestures that the truth lived, the way her shoulders would ease when she was alone and stiffen, almost imperceptibly, when he entered, the way she would redirect her gaze half a second before his eyes could find hers, not out of coldness, but out of something far more complicated. She was not indifferent to Alistair. She had never been indifferent to him. That was precisely the problem. Indifference would have been so much easier to carry. Those who knew Dorothea well, and very few truly did, might have recognized what was happening beneath that impeccable surface. She was not falling out of love. She was learning to hide the fact that she had never quite fallen out of it at all. Every small retreat, every carefully maintained distance, every redirected glance was not the behavior of a woman who felt nothing. It was the behavior of a woman who felt far too much and had found no safe place to put it. The distance between them had not arrived in one dramatic moment. There had been no argument that drew a line across the floor of Ashworth House, no cold declaration, no slammed door that changed the shape of things forever. Instead, it had come the way fog comes, slowly, quietly, until one morning you look up and can no longer see the other shore. By the time either of them might have named it, it had already become the architecture of their days. Alistair moved through his world, his estates, his parliamentary obligations, his careful management of a dukedom that demanded everything and forgave nothing, with the assurance of a man who believed that providing was the same as being present. He had given Dorothea a magnificent house. He had given her position, security, a name that opened every door in London. What had never occurred to him, not once in all those months, was that she had never asked for any of it. What she had asked for, quietly, in the language of small gestures and open doors and evenings she had not yet given up on, he had never learned to read. And Dorothea, for her part, had made her own silent decision. She would not beg to be seen. She had too much dignity for that, and perhaps too much pride, and perhaps, though she would not have admitted it. Too much fear of what it would mean if she asked. And he still did not answer. So she kept her silence. He kept his distance, and between them, in the space where a marriage was supposed to live, there was nothing but the quiet, careful sound of two people who had never learned to reach for each other. It had been raining for 3 days without pause, the kind of relentless English rain that seals a house in on itself and makes the outside world feel very far away. Dorothea had spent the afternoon by the fire in the library, not reading, simply sitting with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, and a thought she could not quite put down. That evening, Alistair had returned earlier than usual. She heard his coat being taken at the door. She heard his footsteps, and for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, she did not reach for her armor. He came to stand near the window, loosening his cravat with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been performing competence for too many hours. The fire crackled between them. The rain pressed against the glass, and Dorothea opened her mouth. Not with a plan, not with rehearsed words, but with something raw and unguarded that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this kind of quiet. She was going to tell him. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to crack the surface of what they had become. Then Alistair turned, glanced toward the door and said, "I have correspondence to finish before morning." He said it without malice, without awareness, without the faintest understanding of what he had just walked past. Dorothea closed her mouth. She looked back at the fire. She picked up her cold cup of tea. And the thing she had been about to say folded itself back into the place where she kept everything he had never thought to ask about. That night, something shifted inside her. Not dramatically, not with tears, simply and irrevocably, like a key turning in a lock that would not easily be opened again. It was Mrs. Pembley, the housekeeper of 23 years, who first said something, not to the Duke, she would never have dared, but to the lady's maid in the quiet of the servants' corridor on a Tuesday morning. She had noticed, she said, that her Grace no longer asked for a second candle in the evenings. She used to. In the early months, Dorothea would request a second candle so she could read later into the night, and there had been something almost hopeful about it, as if she were staying awake for a reason. Now the lights went out early, and the house felt different for it. Alistair's younger sister, Lady Constance, noticed something else entirely. She visited Ashworth House on a bright Thursday in March, and found Dorothea in the garden, speaking with the groundskeeper about the rose beds with a quiet authority and a genuine smile that Constance had not seen on her sister-in-law's face in months. But the moment Dorothea was told that Alistair had arrived home unexpectedly, that smile disappeared. Not replaced by unhappiness, replaced by nothing. A careful, practiced neutrality that was somehow worse. Constance said nothing that day, but she thought about it for a very long time afterward. Even Dorothea's own reflection had begun to tell the story. There was a particular mirror in the upper hallway, the one she passed every morning on her way to breakfast, and she had developed the habit of not looking at it directly. Not out of vanity, and not out of sorrow exactly, but because the woman in that mirror had begun to look like someone who had made peace with something she should not have had to make peace with. The servants saw it, the sister saw it, the mirror saw it. The only person in Ashworth House who moved through those rooms entirely unaware was the one whose name was above the door. It began with the garden. Dorothea had always loved growing things. Her mother had kept a small, untidy kitchen garden at the rectory, and something about soil and patience and the quiet discipline of tending had always settled her in a way that drawing rooms never could. At Ashworth, The gardens were vast and formally arranged, and had been maintained for decades by people who knew precisely what they were doing. She had no practical reason to involve herself. She involved herself anyway. Then came the reading circle, a small gathering of 4 women, wives of local landowners, who met on alternate Wednesdays to discuss whatever book one of them had pressed into the other's hands the fortnight before. Dorothea had been invited in her first autumn at Ashworth, and had declined twice, operating under the assumption that a duchess ought to be somewhat more selective about how she spent her afternoons. By her second year, she had quietly become the one who chose the books. It was, she reflected once while walking home from Mrs. Hartley's drawing room with color in her cheeks, and an opinion she had not had to swallow, the best 2 hours of her week. She was not building a life in opposition to Alistair. She had no interest in opposition. She was simply building one, carefully, quietly, in the spaces he had never thought to occupy. A library corner that was entirely hers, a correspondence with a cousin in Edinburgh that brought her more genuine warmth than any dinner party in London, a habit of walking the East Meadow at dusk, when the light turned the grass the color of old gold. These were small things, but they were hers, and in a marriage where so much had been given and so little had been chosen, the things that were truly hers had begun to matter more than she could easily explain. It was entirely by accident. Alistair had taken a different route through the house that afternoon. Some issue with the west corridor, a repair long overdue, and had found himself passing the tall windows that looked out over the rear gardens. He had walked past those windows hundreds of times. He had never once stopped at them. He stopped that afternoon. Because there was Dorothea, kneeling beside the rose bed in a plain dress with dirt on her gloves, laughing at something the groundskeeper had just said. Not the careful, social laugh he heard from her at dinners. A real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that belonged to a person who had momentarily forgotten to manage how she appeared. It transformed her face in a way he had not seen before, or perhaps had not looked for before. He was not entirely sure which, and the uncertainty unsettled him more than he expected. He stood at that window for longer than made any practical sense. She did not look up. She went back to the roses, her hands moving with a quiet confidence that spoke of someone deeply at home in what they were doing. Alistair watched her and felt, for the first time in their marriage, that he was looking at a woman he did not know, not because she had hidden herself, but because he had never made the particular effort required to see her. He turned from the window when she stood to move further along the bed. He walked back to his study. He sat down at his desk, and he did not pick up his pen for a very long time. Alistair stood at that window longer than he intended, and somewhere across London, someone just like him is beginning to understand what it means to finally see someone who was always there. If this story is already pulling at something in you, don't let the next chapter find you by accident. Subscribe to Dukedom Stories right now. Thousands of people are already waiting for what comes next, and you deserve to be one of them. Now back to Dorothea. Because what happens at the Hartwell Ball will change everything. The Hartwell Ball was the event of the season. 500 guests, 3 orchestras, and enough social maneuvering to exhaust a diplomat. Dorothea wore a gown the color of deep water, and Alistair noted somewhere between the second and third introduction of the evening that she looked exceptionally well. He did not say so. He moved on to the next conversation, and she moved on to hers, and this was how they generally managed evenings of this kind, as 2 skilled and separate performances that happened to share a carriage home. It was during the second hour that Lord Pembroke found Dorothea near the refreshment table. He was charming in the effortless way of men who have never had to work very hard to be liked. Easy conversation, genuine attention, a way of listening that made the person across from him feel that what they were saying mattered. He asked Dorothea about her reading circle. He asked about the gardens at Ashworth. He asked casually and without agenda how she was finding the season. She answered, and as she did, something in her posture opened, almost without her permission, in the way that things open when they have been closed for too long. Alistair saw it from across the room. He was mid-sentence when his eyes found her, and he lost the thread of what he had been saying in a way that was entirely unlike him. He recovered quickly, he always did, and returned his attention to the conversation in front of him. But something had taken root in his chest that had no name yet and no clear shape, only a sharp, unfamiliar discomfort that followed him for the remainder of the evening and into the carriage ride home, where Dorothea sat beside him in perfect silence, and he found, for the first time, that her silence felt like something he did not know how to answer. The morning after the Hartwell ball, Dorothea came down to breakfast at her usual hour and found Alistair already at the table, which was unusual. He looked up when she entered. She nodded, took her seat, and reached for the teapot with the unhurried composure of a woman who had nothing particular on her mind. Neither of them mentioned Lord Pembroke. Neither of them mentioned the ball at all. The silence between them was the same silence it had always been, and yet it sat differently now, like a piece of furniture moved 2 inches from where it had always stood. No one could say exactly what had changed, only that something had. Alistair unfolded his newspaper. Dorothea looked out the window. 2 people in the same room, performing indifference with the quiet precision of those who had practiced it long enough to almost believe it themselves. But beneath the surface of that breakfast table, something had shifted that no amount of correct posture could entirely conceal. He had seen her laugh the day before, truly laugh, for a man who had simply thought to ask. And she had felt him watching. And neither of them, for all their considerable self-possession, knew quite what to do with what that meant. It did not happen with a scene. There was no morning where Dorothea woke and made a conscious decision. It was more like the natural conclusion of something that had been arriving for a very long time. The way a candle does not dramatically extinguish itself, but simply reaches the end of what it had to give. Alistair called for her one afternoon from his study. A practical matter. Something about a letter that required her signature. She was in the garden. She heard the footman relay the message, and for the first time, she did not immediately set down what she was doing and go. She finished what she was tending. She took her time. By the time she reached the study, Alistair had already dealt with the matter himself. He glanced up, said it was no longer necessary, and returned to his work. He did not ask what had kept her. She did not explain, but something in the quality of her stillness as she stood in that doorway, something in the way she looked at him, not with anger, not with reproach, but with a kind of calm finality, reached him in a place he had not expected. He looked back at his papers. She turned and left. And the house, somehow, felt quieter than it had before. Alistair was not a man given to reflection of the personal kind. He was precise, analytical, accustomed to problems that could be identified and resolved with the correct application of reason and resources. But in the days following that afternoon in the study, he found himself doing something entirely unfamiliar. He found himself reviewing the past. Not the broad strokes of it, not the estates or the obligations or the parliamentary record, but the small things, the particular things, the way Dorothea used to pause in the doorway of a room before entering, as if giving herself a moment to compose herself. The way she had stopped doing that at some point, and he could not remember exactly when. The more he reviewed, the more uncomfortable the accounting became. She had tried. He began to understand. Not loudly, not with demands, but in the quiet, persistent way of someone who believes that if they simply remain present long enough, they will eventually be met. She had tried in the early evenings she had once kept free, in the questions she had asked at dinner before she stopped asking them, in the book she used to leave on the side table in his study, a small, unspoken suggestion that had disappeared one day and never returned. He had noticed none of it at the time. He was noticing all of it now, and the distance between those two facts felt, for the first time, like something he could be held responsible for. It was behind a volume of Keats on the library shelf, a folded piece of paper that had slipped between the pages and fallen when Alistair reached for the book on a restless evening when sleep had refused to come. He almost set it aside. He recognized the handwriting before he had read a single word, and something in him already knew, with the particular instinct of a person about to be changed by something, that he should read it slowly. It was not addressed to him. It was not addressed to anyone. It was the kind of letter a person writes not to send, but to survive, to take what is living inside them and give it somewhere to exist outside the body, if only on paper. Dorothea had written about the night she had almost told him everything, and how she had swallowed the words when he walked away. She had written about the garden and what it meant to tend something that responded to care. She had written, in one line near the bottom of the page, that he had to read 3 times before it fully reached him. I did not stop loving you. I simply stopped believing you would ever think to look. Alistair stood in the library for a long time after that. The house was completely still. And he felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, exactly what he had done. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the library until the fire reduced itself to embers, and the first gray light of morning began to press against the windows. And he did not move from the chair because moving felt like it would require a version of himself he was not yet sure he could locate. The letter lay folded on the table beside him. He had read it 4 times. Each reading had taken something from him. Some layer of the certainty he had carried for years that he was, in all the ways that mattered, a man who did his duty well. What the letter had done, quietly and without mercy, was show him the precise shape of his absence. Not the absence of provision or protection or the outward performance of a husband. Those he had managed perfectly well. The absence of attention, of curiosity, of the simplest human question. How are you? He had built a life beside Dorothea without ever once treating her interior world as something worth exploring. And she had loved him through it, not loudly, not with ultimatums, but with the steady, patient, exhausting love of a woman who kept showing up long after she had reason to stop. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, close to him. It was, he understood now, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him, and he had needed to find it by accident, because she had never believed he would look. In the days that followed, Dorothea noticed nothing different about Alistair, at least not at first. He was present at meals, composed in company, unhurried in his movements through the house. She had no reason to suspect that anything had changed inside him, because the outside of him looked precisely the same as it always had, and she had long since stopped looking for signs in a man who had taught her, gradually and without intention, not to expect them. What she could not see was what he was carrying, the letter in his coat pocket, the 4 readings of it that had rearranged something fundamental in the way he understood their life together. Alistair moved through those days with the particular weight of a man who has been shown the truth about himself and cannot unknow it, who must now decide quietly and without audience what kind of person he intends to become. Dorothea went about her days in the garden, in the library, in the easy rhythms she had built without him. and the distance between them remained, on the surface, unchanged. But beneath it, for the first time, only one of them was still standing still. Alistair did not arrive with words. He had enough self-awareness by then to understand that words, from him, after this long, would land like performances, carefully constructed, easily doubted, the kind of thing a man says when he wants to be forgiven, rather than when he has genuinely changed. So he said nothing, and he began, instead, to pay attention in the only language he believed she might still trust, the language of action, small and consistent and entirely without audience. He left the East Corridor unscheduled on Wednesday mornings, which was when her reading circle met, so the house would be quiet when her friends arrived. He asked Mrs. Pemble which roses Dorothea had requested for the south bed, and made certain the order was placed without being asked. One evening he came to the library and sat in the chair across from hers, not speaking, not requiring anything, and simply read. He did not draw attention to any of it. He made no gesture of the sort that demands to be noticed and thanked. He simply began to be present in the spaces she had built for herself, carefully, the way one approaches something that has learned to be wary, without sudden movements, without expectation, without asking to be let in before he had given her any reason to open the door. It was the roses that gave it away. Dorothea had mentioned the south bed once, in passing, to Mrs. Pemble. Not a request exactly, more a thought spoken aloud. When the bulbs arrived 3 days later, correctly chosen and properly timed for the season, she stood in the garden holding the delivery note and felt something she had not expected to feel. Alarm. Not the alarm of danger, but the far more disorienting alarm of something you had stopped believing in beginning, against all reasonable expectation, to happen. She did not trust it. That was the honest truth of what she felt, beneath the thing that wanted to soften toward him. She had spent too long learning not to expect warmth from that direction, to simply unlearn it because the roses had arrived on time. Hope, she had discovered, was not a comfortable thing to carry once it had been disappointed enough times. It became something closer to a liability, a way of setting yourself up for a fall you could see coming but could not quite bring yourself to avoid. So she thanked Mrs. Pemble for relaying the order, said nothing to Alistair, and went back to her gardening with the careful composure of a woman who was not, under any circumstances, going to allow herself to feel something before she was certain there was something real there to feel. It happened in the library, on an evening in late October when the wind had turned, and the first real cold of autumn had settled over Ashworth like a held breath. Dorothea was reading by the fire. Alistair came in, as he had taken to doing on certain evenings, and sat in the chair across from hers, with a book of his own. They did not speak. The fire moved between them, and the room held the particular stillness of two people who are very aware of each other while pretending, with varying degrees of success, to be focused elsewhere. At some point she looked up, not intentionally, simply the way the eyes move when the mind wanders, and found him already looking at her, not quickly, not with the redirected gaze of someone caught doing something they shouldn't. He held it, and in his expression was something she had never seen there before. Not desire, not strategy, but something quieter and more costly. Something that looked to her careful and reluctant reading of it like remorse. She looked back at her book. Her hands were very still on the page. Across the fireplace, Alistair said nothing, because he had learned by then that silence, from him, was the only gift she might still be willing to receive. And Dorothea sat with her book and her careful hands, and the warmth of the fire, and the unbearable, unwanted, entirely inconvenient truth that she was not, and had never been, indifferent to the man sitting across from her. Lady Vivian Ashcroft arrived in the county on a Friday, with 3 carriages of luggage and the particular self-possession of a woman who has never had reason to doubt her own welcome. She was beautiful in the way that commands a room without effort. Dark-haired, composed, with a social fluency that made every gathering feel as though it had been quietly arranged around her. She and Alistair had known each other years before Dorothea had entered the picture, and the county was not slow to remember this and mention it, repeatedly and with considerable interest, to anyone who would listen. Dorothea heard about Lady Vivian's arrival from her reading circle, delivered with the careful neutrality of women who are being very deliberate about their tone. She received the information with equal neutrality, thanked them, and moved the conversation along. But that evening, alone in the garden after supper, she stood among her roses in the cooling dark and felt something move through her that she could not organize into indifference, no matter how practiced she was at the exercise. It was not quite jealousy, or rather, it was exactly jealousy. And the fact that she felt it at all told her something she had been successfully avoiding for weeks. She was not protecting herself from a man she had stopped caring about. She was protecting herself from one she had never stopped caring about at all. And that, she understood, standing in her garden in the dark, changed absolutely everything. Lady Vivian came to Ashworth House on a Tuesday afternoon. A social call, perfectly appropriate, announced in advance. Dorothea received her in the front drawing room with the composed courtesy of a woman who has had considerable practice at being gracious under pressure. The conversation moved through the expected pleasantries, the county, the season, the state of the roads. Dorothea said all the correct things, and then Lady Vivian, with the particular ease of someone who does not consider other women a serious obstacle, mentioned Alistair by his given name, and smiled in the reminiscing way of shared history, and said how unchanged he was. Dorothea set down her teacup, slowly, carefully, with both hands, and she said, in a voice that was entirely level, "He has changed, actually, quite considerably." She had not planned to say it. It arrived from somewhere below the level of strategy, from the place where the truth lives when it has been compressed for too long. Lady Vivian blinked. Dorothea picked up her teacup again. The conversation continued, but across the hallway, where Alistair had been passing at precisely that moment and had stopped without sound, those 4 words landed with the weight of everything she had never said directly. He stood very still in the corridor until he heard the drawing-room door remain closed, and then he walked to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the garden she had built without him, and understood that she had just defended him, and that it had cost her something to do it. He found her in the garden the following morning, earlier than she usually expected company. The light was still thin and pale, the kind that makes everything look honest, and Dorothea was kneeling beside the south bed, the roses that had arrived without explanation, with her gloves on and her attention fully given to something that could not disappoint her. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path and did not look up, assuming he was passing through on his way to some other obligation, as he generally was. He did not pass through. He stopped beside her, and after a moment, without preamble, without the careful social scaffolding he usually erected, before saying anything of consequence, Alistair asked, "How are you, Dorothea?" Not as a formality, not as the kind of question that expects very well, "Thank you," and moves along. He asked it the way a person asks when they genuinely do not know the answer and have finally understood that not knowing is their own doing. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The morning light was behind him. His expression was open in a way she had never seen it, unguarded in a way that must have cost him considerably. She did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, This man she had shared a house and a name and 4 years of silence with, and for the first time, she let him see that she was looking. She stood slowly and removed her gloves one finger at a time in the unhurried way of someone choosing their words with the same care. Then she looked at him. Directly, steadily, without the protective distance she had spent years perfecting. And she told him the truth. Not all of it at once, but enough. She told him that she had been lonely in ways she had not known how to name, that she had tried, early on, to reach him, and had eventually understood that she did not know how, and had begun to suspect that he did not want to be reached, that she had built her garden and her Wednesdays and her quiet life, not as a rejection of him, but as a means of survival inside a marriage that had never quite learned to hold her. She did not cry. Her voice remained even throughout, which was perhaps the most devastating thing about it. The composure of a woman who has already done her grieving in private, long before the conversation that deserved it. When she finished, Alistair was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know. I found the letter." 3 words that arrived like a key turning. Dorothea went very still. The garden held its breath around them, and then something crossed her face. Not anger at the finding of it, not embarrassment, but something closer to relief. The particular relief of a person who has been seen, finally, in the place they had been most carefully hiding. She nodded once, and the space between them, for the first time in 4 years, felt like something that could possibly be crossed. That evening they sat together in the library, not performing reading, not managing the silence, but simply present with each other in a way that was entirely new, and for that reason, somewhat fragile. Alistair told her things he had not told anyone. About the years before their marriage that had taught him to keep himself at a careful remove. About a grief he had carried so long it had calcified into manner, into distance, into the particular coldness that the world read as authority and Dorothea had lived with as abandonment. He did not offer these things as excuses. He offered them as the truth she deserved to have, because she had given him hers. And Dorothea, listening to him in the firelight with her hands quiet in her lap, understood something she had long suspected, but never been given enough evidence to fully believe, that Alistair's absence had never been indifference. It had been damage. The particular damage of a person who had learned, somewhere along the way, that closeness was a thing that eventually cost you everything, and had spent years organizing his life to avoid the expense. He had not chosen distance over her. He had simply never been shown that love could be a thing you move toward, rather than away from. She had known how to love quietly and persistently. He had not yet known how to let himself be loved at all, and somewhere in the space between those two true things, their marriage had been waiting all along for a conversation neither of them had known how to begin. Spring came to Ashworth the way it always did. Gradually, then all at once. The gardens erupting into color, as if they had been planning it all winter. Dorothea was in the south bed on a morning in April when Alistair came to find her, as he had taken to doing, without agenda, simply to be where she was. He crouched beside her in the way he had learned, unhurried, undemanding, and asked what she was planting. She told him. He listened with the full attention of a man who had recently discovered that listening was not a passive act, but the most active form of love he had ever been asked to practice. It was not a perfect thing, what they were building. It was careful and sometimes slow and occasionally awkward, in the way of two people learning a language they should have been taught much earlier. But it was real. More real than anything they had managed in the years of beautiful silence and careful distance that had come before. Alistair asked her every morning how she was, and Dorothea, who had spent 4 years folding her answers into letters she never sent and gardens she tended alone, began slowly, trustingly, with the courage of someone who has decided that hope is worth the risk, to tell him. Not because he had become perfect, but because he had finally, genuinely, thought to ask. And sometimes, in a marriage that has lost its way, that is exactly where love finds its way back. If Dorothea and Alistair's story moved you, if you recognized something true in a love that almost went unspoken, then this video deserves to find someone else who needs it today. Share it. Send it to someone who understands what it means to love quietly, or to someone who needs a reminder that it is never too late to finally ask. And if you haven't yet, like this video so that more stories like this one can reach the people who are waiting for them. Subscribe to Dukedom Stories and stay close, because the next story is already on its way, and I promise you, it is worth the wait. Until then, take care of the people beside you, and remember to ask how they are.